We have with us today Milt Hurd, and he is going to be presenting Principles of Effective Facilitation, Cat Herding 101. Normally our lunch and learn webinars are an hour, but today this one is an hour and a half. Like all of our other ones, we ask that you hold all your questions till the end. We do encourage you throughout the presentation, you can type questions in the question box on your control panel, and that way Milt is able to look at those towards the end and answer them as they come in. But also, if you would like to click the raise your hand button and ask it live over the webinar towards the end, you're welcome to do that too. Thank you again to the Berkeley group for making these possible. We do these monthly. And we will let you know. We have not confirmed next month's presenter, but we will let you know as soon as we do, and we hope you'll join us for that. With that said, I'm going to turn this over to Milt Hurd, and we will start from there. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you, Martina, and thank you all for being part of this. I appreciate the opportunity from APA to be able to present this session. I have called it Cat Herding 101 simply because sometimes it feels that way, particularly at the beginning of a process. But actually, in my 30-plus years of facilitating hundreds of meetings, I find that facilitation and the process of doing facilitation is one of the most rewarding and fun activities that I do as an urban planning consultant. So let's begin. I'm having a little trouble here, Martina. It's not. Oh, here we go. Okay. The purpose of this training is to provide an overview of general principles as well as specific techniques for facilitating productive meetings. Typically, we're thinking in terms of being part of a public input process or a consensus building process, or in some cases, a specific kind of conflict resolution process. And I would make a note that the emphasis here today that I'm putting on is conducting live meetings, face-to-face interactions, but a lot of these principles that we'll be talking about would also apply to online meetings, which are becoming more common in planning. And so a lot of basic ideas still apply, but the focus here today is mainly on live face-to-face, which is still, I think, our most common form of planning interaction with the public. So these are images of the kinds of meetings we do. You know, most of my experience is local government, so we're meeting in school cafeterias and fire halls and stuff like that, meeting with small ad hoc breakout groups, sometimes a large conference forum like the image below, where you have smaller breakout groups as part of a larger plenary session. So those are just, you know, put images in your mind of the kind of work that we're talking about here. So the agenda for today parts, I'll start with just reviewing the functions of facilitators, what the purpose is in facilitating a meeting of a group. And then we'll talk a little bit about the basic principles of facilitation. These are sort of the big ideas that apply to an overall process of multiple meetings, as well as the principles that apply to a specific session that you're facilitating yourself. And then zero in a little bit on the typical steps for facilitating a specific group discussion. And we'll also look at ground rules, what I like to call protocols. It sounds a little bit less threatening than ground rules. These are hugely important when you're facilitating. And then we'll talk a little bit about handling difficult people, because sometimes you run into those people. And we need to be able to have some tools to deal with that. We'll wrap up with some specific samples of logistical matters. I have a checklist that you can use as kind of a takeaway. Some of you may have already prepared these kind of things for your work, but I've got a checklist that I've built up over the years that is pretty complete, and it's very handy in preparing for a meeting. And then we'll have time for questions and answers. I think my presentation here will be 50 or 60 minutes, so we should have plenty of time to respond to questions that you're noting as we go along. So first, the functions of facilitators, sort of general and specific functions, and then some big ideas. the general functions include ensuring an active and productive and civil discussion in a group, and this applies to whether it's a one-off meeting or a series of meetings. We're trying to ensure that all participants have opportunities to participate, and the meeting isn't dominated by one or two people. We're trying to promote a positive cooperative spirit. That's important, to make it more productive. We're trying to foster continued involvement of the participants. If it's not just a one-off meeting, if it's part of a series of meetings, we want people to stay involved and be engaged. And then we're also trying to ensure a credible and successful overall process, both the individual meeting as well as if it's a series of meetings. Having the credibility will tend to yield greater success. So those are the general ones. Specifically, facilitator, when you're talking about a specific meeting of a small group, you're trying to control the flow and pacing of discussion. You're trying to ensure constructive engagement and not arguments and sidetracks. You're trying to help the group focus on important items and not extraneous matters that aren't relevant to the purpose of the meeting. And you're trying to ensure that results are properly recorded. It's really important to have a good record of the discussion, and that not only for knowledge and for the file, but also to help with credibility of the process and the comfort and confidence that the participants have. So a couple of notes on your role as a facilitator. I sort of have two views of it. There's the lead facilitator, and this is in the context of maybe a series of meetings, and maybe if you have a conference forum session where you have a lot of people in the room, 50 or 100 or more people, you've got a lead facilitator who's sort of coordinating things and designing the overall process and that sort of thing. And then you have the specific, small group work, and maybe you're one of a team of facilitators. And in that case, you're not responsible necessarily for the design of the agenda or the logistics or any of that stuff. But so there's sort of two levels of roles here, typically in meetings. So two big overall ideas I would urge you to keep in mind. One is that facilitation is collaboration. That's what it's all about. Collaboration is about the power to act together. That's what it's all about, is getting people to be able to work together. And in that sense, talk is action. My wife doesn't believe that when she asked me to mow the lawn, but in some cases, talk really is action. And it goes like this. Conversation, that means listening and talking, yields understanding. And understanding yields overcoming fear and finding common ground. Overcoming fear and finding common ground yields the courage to deal with change, because that's often what we're most concerned about, fear of change. And thus, talk is transformative. And so facilitation is usually mostly talk, and it's collaborative talk that can be transformative. Another huge idea is that you gain power by sharing power. And that's somewhat counterintuitive, but good, experienced elected officials typically know this instinctively. And it's because power is not a zero-sum game. Everyone can gain through intelligent collaboration. And this is actually not just intuitive, but it's proven scientifically. Dr. Keltner at the University of California at Berkeley has done studies of this and actually measured and confirmed that power is not a zero-sum game, that you gain it by sharing it. And so that's something to keep in mind, and that's really one of the sort of core principles of facilitation. You're helping people share power. Gandhi said it too. He said, he's got a great phrase that kind of summarizes this. He says, "There go my people, I must follow them, for I am their leader." And most politicians instinctively know that, but it's worth remembering because it really is kind of a magic secret. So another thing to keep in mind is the context and purpose of the meeting. It's, again, sort of an overall function. The design of the agenda and the techniques that you use with your group will depend on the purpose of the meeting and the purpose of the overall process. And sometimes the meeting is about obtaining input or generating ideas. That's fairly creative, often fun. Sometimes it's about building consensus on goals and policies, honing in on some common objective. And sometimes it goes farther than that, and it's about resolving specific policy conflicts. Each one of these is probably more difficult than the one before it. But typically in planning, I think we're facilitating meetings that have one or more of these kinds of purposes. So some other key principles and considerations. The design of the meeting agenda and the process is important. And so you have to understand the purpose, both overall and for the specific meeting or session that you're facilitating. You have to know where and how long each is going to last, where it's going to occur and how long it's going to last. You need to really have the logistics worked out very carefully so you don't get snagged by surprises or forgetful things. And maybe most importantly is the agenda. The design of the agenda is huge because that will allow you to achieve what you want to achieve from the meeting. And I usually like to have two forms. One is the handout version that is distributed, and this simply has the major tasks, timeframes, and sort of the big exercises or tasks that are going to be done. And then the other one is an annotated version, which is a detailed choreography of the meeting, and you just give that to the facilitators. If you have a big session, you have multiple facilitators. If not, you just do that for yourself if it's a lone facilitator meeting with one group. And the annotated version is very detailed. I mean, I like to do it minute by minute practically, task by task, every little thing worked out so that you're not surprised. Doesn't mean you'll follow it exactly because you have to improvise, but you've got everything really worked out so you understand that the things you're trying to do in the meeting will fit into the time frame that you've allocated. So things like moving easels around or having a period for discussion versus creating ideas and putting them up on a flip chart. All these different tasks need to be worked out. And then who participates? This is often, sometimes it applies to the specific meeting, sometimes it's to the larger process, but knowing who is invited, who is recruited, who do you expect to be there, those are all important. The authority and duration of the group is important. Sometimes you're facilitating just an ad hoc group that's made up out of a plenary group at a meeting. It's very informal. Other times you might be facilitating a standing committee that has a life of several months, and they have maybe greater authority. Well, what is their authority? What's the duration of the group? That needs to be explicit from the beginning so everyone understands that. How information is brought into the process, both overall and at a particular meeting, is important. Not as important these days, maybe in some ways, as it used to be before the web and digital forms of information, but rules about when information is presented by the participants to their fellow participants is important. It needs to be careful and consistent and fair. And then roles and responsibilities of all the people involved, from the client to the facilitators, if you have technical advisors, to the participants themselves. And then how decisions are made, and this is a big one. Ideally, to me, it's by generally, if possible, it's by consensus, and the exact form of consensus, we'll talk about that later in a minute. But how decisions are made by the group is important. People tend to fall back to Robert's rules, and in a lot of facilitated conditions or circumstances, that's not really the best way. We'll talk about that more a little bit, but the decision-making process and how they're made has to be worked out in advance. And then maybe most important for any meeting and any process is to establish ground rules, and these must be by consensus. And this is sort of the magic sauce for facilitation in my experience, because it is what gives the facilitator his authority and gives the group its authority and gives much greater assurance that a meeting will be run smoothly and productively. We'll talk about these in much more detail later on. So some key strategies to think about or keep in mind, again, as an overall perspective, is to keep participation inclusive. Often there's a tendency in public processes to try to not want the gadflies to show up or the naysayers, the skeptics, but you really want to bend over backward in most situations to keep participation inclusive, to embrace conflict and not avoid it or suppress it. Often conflict is what you're trying to resolve, and so you want to embrace it and work with it as opposed to try to paper over it or suppress it, because it'll probably come up later if you don't deal with it. Showing mutual respect and humility throughout a process, both at a particular meeting and overall, is important. I think, again, that's sort of a magic thing that works wonders if you have the sort of the discipline to always do it and use it. And being flexible but firm and patient. When you're facilitating, you always have time constraints, and often there's just never enough time from what you would want to have. So you've got to be firm with the time, but then you have to also know when to bend a little bit and when to allow the process and the discussion to take its natural course so that people don't get turned off by an excessive amount of rigor. So that's a judgment call that you always have to sort of balance. And then Gary Larson, who I think was a former planner, or a planner in his former life, has this cartoon which kind of sums it up nicely. The guy's trying to talk to a duck, and he starts with German, and then he tries Spanish, and he tries French, and finally he gets the secret of quack, quack, and speaking the right language, and they're able to communicate. And in a way, that's what facilitation does, is it gets us on the same page so we can communicate and talk about differences and be creative and productive in working together. So some basic principles, and this is moving down a little bit and focusing a little bit more on specific meeting sessions, but it's still, there's some of these things apply to an overall process or series of meetings. One is that your power as a facilitator comes from your group. So you want to help the group accept responsibility for a successful outcome. It's their process, not yours, and that's very important. Sometimes people come into a meeting and they think, this facilitator's leading us, it's all on him or her. No, it's on the participants. It's their process, and so you want to make sure that they understand that, and that's where you get your authority to facilitate them. So you want to work on the basis of the consent from the group. You gain power by giving it away. That's what we said earlier. And in fact, you know, an example of that is you can empower them to fire you. Several years ago, I was facilitating a meeting, a strategic planning process for a small rural village in Virginia, and I was hired by a third-party nonprofit organization to work with this community, and so when I came in as a facilitator, they were pretty skeptical of me. I was an outsider. They didn't really trust me. So at the first meeting, I sensed that, and at the first meeting I said, hey, you know, if at any time during my facilitation you don't like it, you can fire me. You can ask me to leave town, and I will. And as soon as I said that, suddenly all their resistance faded away, and they embraced me, and we had a great series of meetings and a very productive, award-winning project, actually. So that's a little extreme, but the idea is that indeed you're giving them the power. You're working on the consent on the basis of their consent. You're not imposing yourself on them. So don't be defensive if you're challenged or criticized. Be polite and patient. Acknowledge people's feelings and their points of view, even if you disagree. You really want to sort of welcome them in and welcome their input. You want to facilitate, not participate. So I think you all probably know that already, but you want to remain neutral and objective at all times. You're a facilitator, not a participant. You want to focus on the process, not the content. You're sort of an outside party. You're the neutral outside party. So your job is really to keep the conversation and the discussion moving, keep it fair, and keep it constructive. And so you don't want to lecture the group or expound on your thoughts. These are all pretty obvious fundamentals, but they're worth keeping in mind because there's a natural tendency, particularly if you're a planning expert from a technical side, if you're trying to facilitate a process, there's a tendency to want to jump in and correct people and that sort of thing. You can make notes, maybe side notes or observations, but you just don't want to insert yourself too much into their discussion. And then, and that's a note here that facilitators sometimes have to also serve as technical or policy advisors. If you're a planner doing a comprehensive plan process, sometimes you're the person writing the plan and doing analysis and also facilitating meetings. And that's a challenge. It's difficult, but it's possible as long as you maintain trust and distinguish your role as a facilitator for one point in time versus a technical analyst or advisor at another point in time or at another meeting. So as long as you maintain that clarity and keep the trust, you can do both things. Sometimes as a practical matter, we just have to do both. But you have to be very careful that you maintain the trust of the group. And so the facilitator serves as a traffic cop or a referee. That's kind of another way to think about it for the group. You're just directing traffic. You want to keep the process moving. You want to be polite but firm, a little bit flexible when needed, and respectful of the participants. You want to make sure each person has a chance and feels invited to speak up, particularly in a small group. You want to prevent any one person from dominating. You want to keep the process fair, and to do that, you can check in with the group as needed to be sure that it's fair. Is everybody okay with how we're doing? Any issues, any problems? You can ask them every now and then. You want to check in because it's important again that that they have have trust in you. You want to listen actively and follow up with questions during the discussion. This is you know, an important thing. You don't want to just ask questions, take comments, and put them on a flip chart. You want to delve in a little bit, dive in, and work with people and draw them out. So you can ask follow-up questions to clarify or illuminate points that are expressed. In fact, just a couple weeks ago, I was facilitating a meeting. This is an example, and it was a brainstorm on the strengths of this small town. And one person said, well, this town is beautiful. And so you could just say, okay, the town's beautiful, that's a strength. But the follow-up question for him was, what do you define as beauty? What is beauty to you? So then he listed things like the tree canopy and the historic buildings and all this stuff. And so it made that piece of input much more valuable and meaningful by asking the follow-up question. You want to fully understand the point or the concern being expressed. If there's any uncertainty about what somebody says in a meeting, ask them again in a different way. Make sure you understand it. And that also, the active listening shows engagement, and that helps build trust as well. It's amazing if you are asking follow-up questions as people give input. It's amazing how much they feel how much better they feel about the process. And so when you meet resistance, whether it's substantive or process, reframe the issues, focus on the procedural agreement before moving on. Make sure everybody's comfortable. Make sure, you know, make any corrections or clarifications that might be needed so that people remain confident that the process is going well and is fair. You want to keep a visible written record of all the input. Typically, you know, in live meetings, we do it on flip charts. That's old technology, but man, it works great because people see it up on the chart. It's very visible. They know they're being heard. They know it's becoming part of the record. It really has a certain sort of power to it. That's very simple but very strong. And ideally, that's done by a separate person, a recorder. But lots of times, depending on staffing needs, you have to be the facilitator and the recorder yourself. It's a little bit more challenging. It can be done, but ideally you have two people working the meeting. You want to accurately record the statements from the group. You want to write concisely with short phrases, not necessarily completely verbatim, because that's usually not practical. You want to get the key words in there, though, the key ideas. And you want to check for consent from the speaker about the input to make sure that you've got it right and accurate. And then you want to record any unrelated issues or ideas on a separate flip chart sheet. I like to call it a parking lot or a bin. And because sometimes people will, regardless of what the assignment is for the discussion, they'll come up with unrelated extraneous ideas. You don't want to diss them by ignoring them or saying that's wrong, but rather you can create a separate list of things to maybe come back to later or include in the record, just so they know they're being heard and respected. You can note any disagreements or concerns, you know, about substance, about the process, about feelings about it. Don't ignore those. If people have concerns or they're upset or they have some beef, make a note of that. Put that on the record. You can maybe resolve it at the time it's expressed. Sometimes you have to come back to it, but deal with it in a positive way so that people feel like things are okay. Things will be fine, even if they have some concerns at that moment. And remember, the process is part of the product. In most planning efforts, whether it's comprehensive planning or strategic planning or whatever, the process is part of the product. In fact, sometimes it's equal to any part of the substance. The process can undermine or ensure success to a technical process, just the procedural aspects of it. So that's why facilitation can be so important. So here are some images again of, you know, typical situations. Small group. On the upper left, it's listening to people give their ideas. Lower left, it's questioning them, asking follow-up questions to make sure you've got a full set of input from them. Upper right, it's recording them on the flip charts, and below it's reporting out. Typically, the reporting out, though, is done by not the facilitator, but by a member of the group. And so this is just a typical sort of generic small group session that we often run into. Work groups may just talk, or they may work with maps or other graphics. You know, in planning processes, particularly comprehensive planning, there's often a situation where you're asking people to express their ideas graphically because the geography is an important component. Often in strategic planning you don't have that, but in comprehensive planning it's often working with graphics and the like. And work groups might be ad hoc or they might be standing committees. They might be ad hoc, formed just informally as part of a larger conference forum type of meeting. Sometimes, though, they're an appointed committee that has a life of weeks or even months as part of an ongoing process. And so either way, the facilitation techniques are quite similar. And standing committees that go on for months can be as small as maybe a dozen, or they can be much larger. I facilitated standing committees of over 30 people. I find that up to a is about right. As it gets more than a couple dozen, it becomes a little bit more, almost too cumbersome to have easily productive meetings, although it can be done. But I think probably a couple dozen is a good target to shoot for as a maximum. And then, if you have a large conference forum and ad hoc work groups doing exercises, then they'll report out group by group, often at the end of the meeting, to share results. Those are just sort of some typical kinds of situations we deal with as facilitators. So those are the sort of the basic principles. Let's look more closely at typical steps for facilitating a discussion. And these, what I'm going to talk about now, is a little bit more focused on actually running a meeting, whether it's part of a larger process or just, you at this, okay, you're in front of a table of, 6 or 8 or 10 people and you're facilitating the session. Some of these ideas we'll talk about here do have a larger context, but and could apply to maybe facilitating a larger plenary group of 50 or 100 people. But generally, what we're talking about here in the next few minutes is you're live in front of a group and you're doing your job as a facilitator. So in advance, you want to prepare for the session. You want to establish and affirm the purpose and objectives of the session. You really need to know what you're trying to achieve in the discussion you're about to facilitate. You want to have a clear design of the agenda. That's the exercises that people are going to do. What are the questions that are going to be asked? What would you expect them to actually do? What the process is, what the timing is, how much timing do you have for each piece of work that they're going to do with you. The logistics, do they need markers or handouts or that kind of thing? Do you have the easels in place, etc.? And then affirming responsibilities. Some of these are done in advance of the meeting and sometimes led by the lead facilitator as opposed to you if you're just part of a team. But those things need to be done in advance. And ensure the proper assignment, recruitment, and notification of participants. Again, that's something that the lead facilitator would be responsible for in advance of a meeting. Often these days it's recruitment is key, but always notification is key so that you get the word out and people know when and where they're expected to show up. And also before facilitating, you need to either decide or understand how the meeting will fit into the larger process. That's good for you as a facilitator. It's also important for the participants to understand. They need to know why they're there and how their work will benefit the larger effort. Who will participate is good to know in advance. Generally, you don't necessarily have to know each individual, but just the general scope of who you expect to be there is helpful to prepare for the session. And it's also helpful, not necessary, but helpful to understand what the likely major potential points of conflict might be. And this, again, depends a little bit on the overall purpose of the meeting, whether it's just getting ideas, which isn't a big deal, but if it's trying to build consensus or resolve a conflict, it's good to know what those potential friction points might be. And then what the desired outcome is. You need to know that as a facilitator, what the product is, not necessarily the ideas, but what type of product it is that you're expected to produce. And the logistics. Obviously, you need to know those. The space that you're meeting in, the furniture that's there, the lighting, the sound, any refreshments that are needed, all those things have to be worked out in great detail. And also, of course, who's responsible for each logistical item. You don't want somebody to say, oh, I thought you were supposed to show up with the food. You don't want that to happen. And then in terms of meeting procedures, you want to, so your meeting starts and you're at the head of the table. You want to welcome the group, have introductions all around. Sometimes that's covered with a sign-up sheet, but introductions are nice so everybody knows who's there. You introduce yourself and why you're there. Define your role very clearly. Make it clear that you're a facilitator and not some technical advisor. You want to review the agenda for the session, the objectives, the priorities, the exercises and tasks that you might be doing, and the procedures for the session, how it's going to work. how people are going to work together. And then you want to review the proposed ground rules. I like to call them protocols. And a real important thing here is you want to get consent. And I like to either post these on a flip chart or put them on the back of the handout sheet, maybe the back of the agenda, so people have them in front of them. But it's critical to get consent, and it may mean that you have to tweak them if you get pushback. Usually, in my experience, I find that people accept the ground rules, but that's your basis of authority, is having the ground rules agreed to by the group and having them help you enforce them. So you want to reaffirm consent on all these things, the timing, the ground rules, and all this stuff as needed during the course of the discussion. Make sure everybody's continuing to be comfortable with the procedures. You also want to choose a recorder from the group if it's not assigned in advance. Ideally, it would be part of your consulting team or your staff team. You'd have a facilitator and a recorder for each group that you're working with. Sometimes you don't have the person power to do that, and if so, you might get somebody from the group, or you just do both yourself as a facilitator. And you want to also choose a reporter if you're reporting out at the end of the session to a larger group. And if you do that, it's really good to have it come from one of the participants, not from you as a facilitator. I've done it both ways, and it depends a little bit on the details of the meeting and what's feasible. But ideally, you have somebody from the group reporting out for that group. It gives a strong sense of ownership when you do that, and actually sometimes they can do a better job. So you initiate the discussion by asking for ideas from the group based upon the assignment that you have, whether it's brainstorming or whether it's getting feedback on a particular proposal or whatever it is, and you record those ideas on the flip chart sheets. You call on people as necessary. You want to make sure everyone is participating. You don't want to force people, but you want to draw them out. And there are a couple other options for that. You can either just open it up to people and call on them, or you can call on each person in sequence to make sure everybody has a chance. And that, in fact, encourages them as well without forcing them. Or you can have participants write their ideas, say on index cards or worksheets prior to the discussion, so that it gives them a chance to kind of get things in their mind and sort of think of stuff. And then when you open for discussion, they're primed and they're ready to talk, and it can be a lot more productive. You want to keep the group on schedule, and you can do that very gently, and with body language and other things, you just want to nudge them along if they get hung up on something. And if you have to, you can remind them of the time frame that you have. You don't want to be too pushy on that, but you want to make sure they're aware of it. And at the close, you thank the participants and let them know what happens next in the process. You want to put your name, the recorder's name, and the date on the flip chart sheets, and then you close your meeting. So after the facilitation, you want to disseminate notes to the participants and interested parties, and you want to invite feedback on the session. And sometimes those tasks are done by the lead facilitator. It may not be you if you're part of a team. So some key things to remember during your facilitation. One is to stay neutral and non-defensive. We said that before. It's always worth remembering. And sometimes it takes quite a bit of discipline because sometimes you hear some wacky stuff. You have to stay neutral. Use the consent of the group as the basis for all the decisions. Your authority, whether your authority, the changes to the agenda, all this is subject to the consent of the group. And so remember, it's their meeting, not yours. So keep that in mind and always be willing to rely on their consent. Record unrelated ideas on a separate flip chart sheet. We talked about that, the parking lot or the bin. That way you give respect to the speaker, but you don't let it derail the course of the conversation. And another note here, facilitation skills are dynamic live action skills. They require active improvisation and creative interaction. It takes practice to do that. It's hard to get that out of a book or listening to someone like me talk. You have to practice it. So look for opportunities to exercise the skill and get comfortable with it. You can think of yourself as a crowd whisperer. In a way, that's kind of what you're doing. And if things go well, it feels like that's what you're doing. So a facilitator has immense power and yet no power. It's a paradox. So enjoy it. It is that you gain power by giving it up, and it is a kind of paradox, but it's fun. So we do enjoy it. Like I said, it's one of my most rewarding tasks that I do as a planner. So some typical ground rules. You can use as many of these as you need. This is kind of my long list, and I usually just use 4 or 5 of these, depending on the nature of the meeting and the circumstances. One is that the group decisions are made by consensus. I always use this one, or try to use it when at all possible, and usually it is accepted, and usually it does work. It's a great tool. We'll talk a little bit more about the details of that in a minute. But in these ground rules, often it's the lead facilitator who's designing these and offering it to a group. Sometimes it's done subgroup by subgroup. Again, this depends on the context of the meeting. A lot of meetings are just a small group, and that's the whole, just the small group. Other times it's some breakout group as part of a larger meeting. And so we got these different contexts that we're talking about here at the same time. But whoever has the authority to set or propose ground rules, I like to start with decisions by consensus. If the session calls for brainstorming, then make that a ground rule, because often, even in a brainstorm session, people have a tendency to get into a debate or an argument or a discussion. So if it is a brainstorm session, it may not be, but if it is, make that a ground rule. Keeping comments brief, I always like to use that. And what I say is, keep your comments brief and we'll come back to you once we get through everybody. That way it stays lively, it makes sure everybody gets involved. It doesn't curtail any input, it just spreads it out. Raising your hand, sometimes that's a useful one, and directing comments to the facilitator. Those sort of go together. Sometimes that's useful and necessary. I always use listen actively and be courteous, and you can kind of combine these. For example, keep comments brief and courteous can be one ground rule. You can combine these, but that's always an important one, courtesy and brevity. And then one person talking at a time, that's also a critical one. I always use that. You don't want sidebar conversations. You don't want the meeting to break apart into pieces. You want everybody on the same page all the time. And then sharing responsibility for the outcome. That's another one I always like to use, because indeed that's the truth of a facilitated meeting. The participants own it. It's their process. They have responsibility. You're just helping them. And have fun. So, that's relevant for some meetings, like a brainstorm session. Sometimes it's a little too serious to use this when I offer this as a ground rule. This is more inspirational, and it'll depend on the nature of the meeting. Sometimes it's a little too serious to use that, but when you can, it's a good one, because it does remind people that they're in it together. It is fun, it's creative, and it's enjoyable as well as meaningful. So 3 or 4 of these I like to use, and always I try to get decision by consensus. So that brings us to consensus building and prioritizing, and there are lots of tools for this. You can have a separate webinar on any of these tools, so we'll just touch on these lightly, but a few of these offer 2 or 3 here that I find useful. One is the nominal group technique. That's been around for decades. Many of you are familiar with that. The twist that I find favorable is you start with, say, you have a series of small groups. Each small group generates ideas and ranks them within their small group. Then all the small groups get together, combine their ideas into a non-redundant list, and re-rank it as a group. And that really does sort of let the top ideas emerge to the top in a very comfortable, organic way. It's a good way to kind of work toward a consensus understanding of an issue. And then just smaller pieces of that, voting, polling, or ranking in a small group. I generally prefer ranking, because it tends to be inclusive and not a kind of win or lose kind of evaluation, and it does let ideas sort of float to the top, again, if it happens over the course of time, as well as at just one meeting. And then there's the emerging consensus through discussion. I found over the years that I am able to use this a lot more. There's one approach called the Quaker process, which is kind of like this, and it basically is the group is talking through options. They're evaluating options together, pros and cons, and sort of different scenarios, and the consensus of the group emerges as they all sort of gravitate to one sort of idea that is more persuasive to all of them. And sometimes just the discussion will produce a sense of consensus, particularly in a small group. It's a really a good process if it can work. And the difficulty here is sometimes you have to choose one of these in advance, and emergent consensus sometimes can work, sometimes not, and so you have to make that call early on to know that you want to use it. And then with all these, and there's others, of course. These are three that I particularly like, but there are others. But for all of them, an important aspect of this is defining consensus. That's really key. And there are different levels of consensus. Often we think of consensus as being one thing, which is sort of unanimity. That's not necessarily the case. So, for example, the one we always think of is I love it all. I agree, totally, I agree. And that's consensus. Everyone agrees to all parts of an idea or a proposal. Well, that's rare, and it's not necessary to have that to call it consensus, I think, both as a practical matter and as a public policy matter. The second level, which I like a lot, is I can live with it. I understand it. That implies or really defines a certain level of support and success and agreement. It's not enthusiastic necessarily, but you can live with it. It's good enough. That's an easier standard to meet, and usually for most things fully adequate to serve as consensus benchmark. And then there's broad consensus. I like this one too. That's not everyone, but it's most people. It's a super majority, a super majority. Maybe it's 90+%. Maybe it's full agreement -1 or full agreement -2. What it does is it defines consensus as most people, but doesn't allow one or two people to have veto power over what would otherwise be broad agreement. So that's very practical as well, and still can be considered, consensus as a practical matter. And then there's lower levels. I will not oppose it or undermine it, but I don't necessarily agree with it. Well, that's okay, but that does suggest some erosion in the future in terms of broad support. And then finally, I can support the package, but I object to parts of it. Again, that's a lower level of agreement. Sometimes that has to be the level that you live with, but hopefully you can get up to number 2 or 3 there. I can live with it or a broad consensus. And again, it's best to try to define this standard in advance, and sometimes you have to use judgment about what you think will be feasible. It's possible to change it mid-course, again, with consensus among the participants to change the standard, but hopefully you can pick one of these and carry it through to the end of the process. So that brings us to handling difficult people. We do sometimes run into these, as you well know if you've done any facilitation. And remember, the facilitator's authority is derived from the consent of the group. You rely on the group to enforce your authority through the ground rules. That is kind of a fundamental, and that's always worth remembering. And you can accept that you can't control everything or everyone. You try your best, and usually you can control everyone good enough through the support of the group, but sometimes it's particularly difficult. Don't take challenges or disruptions personally. They're not usually about you. They're usually about some other process that's evident in the community. And the thing is, most disruptive people are one of 2 types. Type 1 is what I call the typical or inadvertent disruptor. The most common, these are the most common and relatively easy to handle because they're not pernicious generally. They're usually willing to go along with the program with sufficient guidance. You just have to kind of remind them of the situation and the purpose of the meeting and get them back in line. So there's 4 types that are common. One is the talkers. These are the people that go on and they won't be concise. This is very common because lots of times people have a lot of energy, built up energy, so they come into the meeting and man, they got a lot to say, and sometimes they just won't stop. Another one is the debaters, the people who challenge points that are made by others. They're sort of argumentative. They want to argue and discuss and wrestle. And then there's the lecturers. This is also common. People who want to expound on their knowledge and share it with others and give people information and sort of teach. And then there are the interrupters, the people who interrupt with extraneous points. Maybe they're just, their minds are going in a lot of different directions and they're constantly interrupting. And then you get people that are combinations of these. These are very typical, and they usually exhibit one or more of these traits. Sometimes they just want attention and recognition. It's their sort of their personality. Sometimes they want a specific outcome and they're willing to fight for it and push for it. And that's often the debaters are like that. Sometimes they just don't know a more constructive way to participate. Sometimes they're not familiar with a facilitated discussion and they're prone to just falling into argument. And sometimes they think they're being helpful. The lecturers, the teachers often think that they're actually helping the process, even if they're rambling on and on. So the general approach to incorporating these kinds of disruptors is to, one, give them attention, show them respect, don't diss them, acknowledge their concerns, invite their positive participation, but remind them of the ground rules. Remind them that everybody's in this. We have to share the floor with others. So remind them of the ground rules, that everyone deserves an equal chance to participate with all due respect. Remember that they will not be changed by sort of demands or bribes or anything. That will just increase distrust. You have to rely on the group. You don't try to be the lone enforcer. You have to draw on the group's affirmation of the ground rules and simply remind them politely. And you can assure them that they're being heard. That's really key, because if they're confident that they're not going to be forgotten and their ideas are going to stay alive, they're much more willing to go along with the ground rules. And assure them, too, that they'll have further opportunities during the process until, in a typical comprehensive planning process, for example, until the elected body adopts the final document, there are opportunities to participate. So almost every meeting you have, you can say, there's going to be future opportunities to participate. And more even these days with web access and web forums in public processes. So that's another way to sort of move it off center and get them back into the discipline of the time frame for the live meeting that you're facilitating. You can invite them and challenge them to join in by listening to their fellow participants. That's always helpful because that's, of course, why you're there. So those types are actually usually easy to handle because they're generally well-intended people. But then there's the other type, which is this, what I call the strategic disruptor. These are people who are not willing to go along and, in fact, often have a purposeful strategy of disruption. They actually want to disrupt the meeting. In these cases, you need to insist on and rely on clear ground rules for dialogue and establish that at the very beginning of the meeting and ask that everyone present commit to follow and enforce them together. And sometimes that means if you think that you're going to have strategic disruptors in attendance, because often they're organized, after welcoming people, the first thing out of the lead facilitator's mouth might be ground rules, and establishing those ground rules right out of the chute, so that everybody is on notice, and you're putting pressure on everybody to agree, even if you need to amend the ground rules or adjust the ones that are proposed. You put everybody on notice that this is how we're going to operate the meeting. That often will reduce the level of disruption, even from strategic disruptors. If there's any concern that a purposeful disruptor is going to be present, you can also add a rule requiring honest and free policy discussions and not personal or ad hominem attacks. And again, it depends a little bit on, you're trying to put them on notice that you're aware that this issue is out there and you're trying to have a productive meeting. You can also insist on having the disruptor state very clearly the objections that he or she might have for the record and putting that on record. Again, by doing that, you're bringing them into the meeting and reducing their success at just a wholesale disruption. You want to emphasize sharing responsibility for the outcome. We're all in this together. Sometimes the strategic disruptors aren't really disagreeing with the people in the room. They're afraid that there's some larger force at play, like the federal government, for example. And so if you're emphasizing, hey, we have people from the neighborhood here, that's who's making these decisions, join in with us, we're all in this together, sometimes that, again, will lower the temperature a bit. You can also emphasize protection of the rights of those who are present who wish to hold the meeting. And again, that can be persuasive. And focus on how every citizen can help solve local community problems. Again, this works good if, in fact, it's a local community process. And in most of my work it is. I usually work for county, cities, and towns, and so it is usually very localized, and that it's a good thing to rely on if you have somebody who is fearing that there's some larger force, a malevolent force out there. But always continue to show respect and patience. Avoid being defensive, even for the strategic disruptors. You can build trust by being transparent, open, and inclusive. It's hard for them to fight you if you're really being truly open with them. And you want to verify information openly and objectively. Acknowledge any gaps or uncertainty. Sometimes strategic disruptors will challenge all the information you might be presenting, or the technical people at the meeting are presenting. And you can be open about that. You can say, hey, we'll make note of that. We'll go back and verify that. Here's what we think about it. Here's why we think it's valid, but let's make a note of that. We respect your concern about that. We will have to go back and double check. That's fine. And you can also use planning ahead. If you expect to have strategic disruptors, you can use steering committees or ad hoc topic committees to obtain more orderly representation of the disruptors. So you can get them in smaller groups, and you can get them in a more orderly process so they're actually part of the process. Sometimes they won't do that. If they're really against the whole thing, they won't even join in. But you can invite that, and sometimes you can get that to work. So it's kind of breaking down the scale of the forum. You can also ask for other ideas for improving the legitimacy and quality of the process. Just ask them, hey, how can we make this better? How can we solve or resolve your concerns? Also, if a disruptor is totally uncooperative and actively interferes with willing participants, you can respectfully insist that he or she take up the issue later in a separate forum. But if you do that, you need to identify what that forum might be. It could be another meeting, it could be a more private conversation, whatever it is, you can ask for that. And often such attacks are aimed at the very legitimacy of the larger process that you're in. And if so, you can ask the disruptor to put his concerns on record and then move on with the meeting. So again, you're showing respect. You're saying, yeah, we hear you. We're gonna deal with this, but right now we want to keep having this discussion with our fellow neighbors. In the worst case scenario, you can call recess to the meeting and talk individually with the disruptor and ask them to follow the rules or leave the meeting. That's kind of a last resort. But try at all costs not to end the meeting prematurely. Don't let somebody sabotage a meeting that most people in the room want to have. That's disrespectful to them, and you want to try at all costs not to let that happen. In all cases, do as the Brits do, be calm and carry on. So a sample logistics checklist for a group meeting. This is really more of a takeaway, but this might be helpful just as a double check for y'all's work. Advanced tasks include scheduling the meeting, announcing and advertising, notifying participants, reserving the space, making sure it's suitable in terms of size, lighting, acoustics, breakout rooms, furniture, etc. And then the space setup. You want to post directional signs inside and outside the building as needed. You want to have tables. Typically round tables are good, but you generally work with what you got. Having flip charts and easels for each breakout if you have multiple breakouts. Having them numbered and dated in advance is handy. Having blank base maps or other worksheets as needed, whatever materials you want groups to work with. Having chairs around the tables, or it could be a classroom style or a semicircle for larger plenary discussions. Those work as well. The classroom style in rows is a little bit stilted. I prefer semicircles or chairs around tables, but again, that depends a little bit on other logistical concerns for the meeting. A sign-in table at the entrance with handouts is good, and setting up the breakout rooms in advance as needed if you're going to separate rooms. And then copies of handouts for the participants. You want the agenda in their hand. The proposed ground rules on the back is nice. Contact data, with websites or phone numbers of contact people. A project summary with the purpose and schedule and roles of the participants, that kind of thing. Worksheets as needed for the participants if they have things they want to fill out to generate ideas as part of their exercises. And for the facilitators, you want the notes or the annotated agenda with the detailed choreography. And of course, that you want to give them well in advance so they can be prepared for the meeting. And in terms of equipment, the projection screen, unless a wall surface is adequate, presuming you're going to use a little bit of PowerPoint, laptop and projector with a remote. Remotes are critical. Don't ever not have a remote. Microphone and audio as needed. extension cords, duct tape, easels with flip chart pads, cameras, both still and video, multiple ones of those, and those are great now since we have smartphones, pretty easy to do. And then materials, base map, and our aerials for display, depending on what you're using. Sometimes you don't have these, but if you do, you want these as needed. You want to make sure you have enough, and you don't get surprised and have a shortage. You want the sign-in sheet at the front of the room when people come in. You want name tags, drafting tape to stick stuff up, markers for flip charts and maps, plenty of them, plenty of spares and backups, pencils and pens for participants in case they didn't bring one and you want them to fill out stuff. And then, of course, refreshments, coffee, juice, water, fruit, as appropriate. With that, I can open it to questions, and hopefully we'll have some. That was about 55 minutes or so. Let's see, I've got one here from Amanda Beck. Will the presentation be available for sharing after this live webinar? I believe it will. Martina could probably answer that.
Do you mean,
yeah.
I guess, is the question if it's recorded? We do record all of our webinars, and they'll be put up online, and what we'll do is we'll send out an alert once this one's been posted. Handout-wise, if everybody notices, the handout, it should be visible in your control panel as, or the PowerPoint presentation should be visible as a handout in your control panel, so you can download that as well. So yes, it'll be available in multiple formats.
Great. Other questions? I only see one, Martina. Is that the only question we have?
That's all you have a hand, Paula Shea.
Okay. Oh, I see another one here. Can you give me an example of how to reframe a discussion when dealing with a conflict? Let's see. Well, I think looking at I can't think of a precise one off the top of my head, but looking at it from a different angle or from a different perspective, maybe from the perspective of somebody other than the speaker. If they've got a problem with it, you can take another view. For example, if it's, say, somebody from a particular neighborhood, you can take the view of someone from a different neighborhood or a different sector of the community and just, show that perspective. Another one is to think of changing the time frame perspective. Just whatever you can do to get the speaker out and looking at it from a different angle. That can be good. It could be if it's that's if it's a substantive conflict. If it's a process conflict about the meeting, then I think you can kind of re-explain why it's being done this way or why it's proposed, and maybe discuss alternatives or tweaks, refinements to it, and maybe be able to make those adjustments if the whole group decides that that's appropriate.
All right, let's Paula, can you go ahead with your question?
The question is, what is a possible approach when too many people show up to a meeting that cannot be accommodated in the meeting space? That's a great one. We're always a little worried about that. The best thing, of course, is in advance make sure you've got plenty, but you can still be surprised. The first fallback, I think, is to try to, okay, so say it's a conference forum and you expect 100 people and 200 people show up. For the plenary session, you try to round up more chairs. Even if you can't sit everybody at a table, you can sit them in chairs so they don't have to stand up. The fallback from that is they have to stand up, in the back of the room, and you're sorry for that, but at least they're there. For the breakouts, the first thing is to try to squeeze in as many people per facilitated breakout session that you can. Maybe you're expecting to do 6 or 8. Maybe you have to go to 12 or 14. You get above that, it gets pretty difficult. So get to a dozen or so, and then maybe you fall back to having some groups self-facilitate and let some of the facilitators roam from one group to another and monitor as opposed to directly facilitate the meeting. That's a last resort kind of, but it's risky. Those are the ones that come to my mind. You can also, if things are really overwhelming, you can say, hey, we're going to schedule another meeting. Obviously, the client would have to approve that, but if you have that capacity, you can say, we're going to do this meeting today, just like we promised, and we're going to do the best we can. But because we have so many people, we're also going to have a follow-up, and we will let you know what the date and time is. It will be within a couple of weeks or whatever you can say. And then you do indeed follow up with everybody who's on the sign-up sheet. Okay, another question is, if there is a contentious issue or a tumultuous history behind an issue, do you recommend acknowledging these tensions openly? If there is some bad blood and a clear lack of understanding of, quote, the other. Again, that's one that you make the call on, but in general, I think the default is yes. If you know something's going to come up and it's a tough one and it's contentious and dangerous to explode, I would acknowledge it at the beginning. Now, how you acknowledge it, you don't necessarily have to be real explicit. You can be general enough that people know what you're talking about without getting too specific that maybe raises emotions. It's a judgment call, but I think in general the default is yes, acknowledge it because it's going to come about, and in fact part of the mission for the meeting that day is to be able to deal with that issue and still work together. I mean, that's almost a challenge to the group, is we know this is an issue, but we still want to work together. Doesn't mean the issue is going to go away. We want to acknowledge it, but we still want to find a way to work together. Can we do that today? And without forgetting about that issue, not necessarily resolving it today because it's a long-standing one, but can we work together for now and make any inputs and observations and recommendations for it as we go through the meeting. Let's see. I'm curious about, wait a minute. Having a hard time seeing this whole question. It says, I am curious about how to deal with that, and I'm not sure what that's referring to.
Milt, why don't we, I'm going to unmute Andrea and maybe help clarify that. So,
oh, okay.
Andrea, do you want to, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, clarify your question?
I don't hear anything.
They just wrote that they don't have a mic. So maybe what we can do is offline, the two of you can connect and maybe clarify that question and we can follow up with people.
Okay, that sounds good. I don't know if they've got my email, but it's milton@herdplanning.com.
And then you have another one that just came in. How do you best deal with elderly people or people that are totally off topic but won't accept the ground rules or let you move on with the topic?
Yes, and I think we often get these sorts of things. And I think one is, again, you're relying on the group to help enforce the rules, the ground rules. So you can appeal to the group, just acknowledge that the group has decided this and that you can speak for them because they've decided it. You can ask them if they have any disagreements with your interpretation, and then you remind this person of that interpretation. So hopefully you can persuade them to indeed accept the ground rules that are accepted by the whole group. If they won't, if it's at the very beginning and they simply won't agree with the proposed and everybody else does, ask them for how the ground rules might be amended and refined. That's always in play. At the beginning of the meeting, you propose those 4, 5, 6 ground rules that I mentioned. If somebody doesn't like one, you say, well, how would you change it to make it acceptable? And if it's not crazy, it might be a good upgrade. It might be suitable for that meeting. And if the whole group agrees, you're done. You've got it. So I think your question has really 2 parts. One is the beginning, setting the ground rules and getting affirmation of that. And you work with people. You work with the group to get that. and make sure everybody's comfortable. Tweak it as needed, as long as it doesn't completely bust the thing open and make it worthless. One is if you're going along in the meeting and they're not following the ground rules. That's the other part. And then you rely on the group. You remind them that the group has agreed upon these, so we need to do this. And if they continue to do that, you can say, hey, please, follow these rules, and we will meet with you separately. We'll take it offline after this meeting or in another session to make it productive. So I think that's, then you're getting into the disruptor territory. And so the key there is respecting them and acknowledging their concerns and really probing into asking them what's wrong with the ground rules and why can't they follow them, and really getting to the core of it. And usually you can solve their problem in that way without having to cave in. And then Charlie's asking, when is law enforcement present appropriate? Yeah, it's pretty rare in my experience, but again, if you have a heads up that things are going to get ugly, it's worth having a couple of deputies there. That's a last resort. In I think 95% of the cases, you don't have that. But again, if you've got strategic disruptors, as an example, sometimes they can be threatening. And if you have any sort of good heads up on that, any legitimate fear that might happen, it's worth maybe having some deputies there. But even when you have that, you want to open the meeting with a very positive message that everyone's there to listen to each other, and we're all learning from each other, and we have other opportunities in the future to keep working on this issue. It's not all going to happen tonight kind of thing, which is almost always the case. So it's a judgment call. You want to have, if you get any inkling that there's going to be a real serious physical issue, then sure, have the law enforcement guys there. They don't have to be a dominant presence, but sometimes sometimes it's in the interest of public safety to do that. We got all the ones so far that have been listed. I think we have. Any follow-ups from those? Did I answer those sufficiently, or is there any follow-up or clarification? It's worth noting that on all this stuff, as you probably could tell, there's a lot of judgment calls and a lot of sort of improvisation, and like I said in one part, that there's a lot of like knowing when to bend and how far to bend versus how firm to be. There's a lot. It's probably more art than science. I've given you a lot of sort of the science part of it, but your experience will inform you about the art part and inform your judgment as you go through these kinds of meetings. How hard to push and when to pull back and that sort of. You'll get a sense of that. Maybe everybody's had to go back to work from their lunch break.
Well, and like we said, we will post this, in the next day or two online, so people can review it as well, and we'll include your contact information as well, Milt. So if people have follow-up questions, they can get in touch with you as follow-up.
Good. I welcome that, and I'll respond to anything I get.
All right. Well, with that, if you don't have anything else, oh, it looks like you had one more question come in.
Okay.
Or maybe just follow up to the question.
Right. It's Ann. She said we had one commission that was getting dementia and was very hard to work with. He finally realized it and had to go off the commission. Okay, that's what it was. That was her specific question. Yeah, that's a tough one. That's very difficult. And I think in that case, if you recognize that was happening, you would talk to the elected body, or the county administrator, and work with that person individually. Yeah, that would be very difficult. But at least it was sort of innocent in a sense, being essentially a medical issue. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Milt, and we will wrap it up. And like I said, we'll get this posted, let everybody know, and you'll get communications when the next one is going to be and what that topic will be. Hopefully in the next week we can send that out. So Thank you so much, and I hope everyone has a nice afternoon.
Thanks, Martina. Thank you all.